Today we begin Chapter 5, and we're looking at Chapter 5.1, which deals with Congress. When you go through this lesson, make sure that you fill in the notes section, and anything that's in red on the PowerPoint, make sure you put into your notes and submit the notes when you're done. Also, make sure you've done the Chapter 5 vocabulary so that you can understand the words and terminology we're using in this chapter. Please feel free to pause as you need to. All right, as we begin to look at Congress, the first question we want to consider is, how does Congress represent the people? Well, they represent the people by passing legislation. Legislation is just simply a word that means laws, and these laws are supposed to benefit their constituents and the nation. Now, that word constituents is one of your vocabulary words, and all that means is that it's a person that is represented by a representative. So we are constituents of Pete Sessions, who is our representative in the United States House of Representatives. We are also constituents of John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, who are the United States senators for Texas in the U.S. Senate. So we are their constituents. So they represent the people by passing laws or legislation that benefit us and that benefit the nation as a whole. Now, what is an interest group? As we look at how people are represented, one of the ways that people are represented and ways they get their voices heard by members of Congress and other people in government is what we form interest groups. Interest groups are organized groups of like-minded people who join together to influence government and its policies. And so what we find is that interest groups are meant to take individual voices and put them together and make one louder voice. Many people look at interest groups and denounce them or say that they're not democratic. I disagree with that. I think that interest groups are very democratic. It's a way that a person like me, who has very little opportunity to be heard by our representatives or senators, can band together with other people and be heard. There are some interest groups that you're probably familiar with. The NRA, or National Rifle Association, is one of the best known interest groups. You have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is an interest group of businesses that voice their concerns to the United States Congress. I'm personally a member of the Association of Texas Professional Educators, and it really doesn't work on a national level, but it does on a state level to state politics, because states control education policy in this country. And so that is an interest group. But an interest group gets their voices heard often by members of Congress through an interest group, because they pool the money and pool the resources to make sure that people get heard. Now, how does Congress's membership differ from the general population of the nation? The general population of the nation does not look like what the members of Congress look like. Members of Congress are typically older. They're typically wealthier than the general population. They generally have quite a bit more money than most people. Most members of Congress are white males, although that has changed in the last few years. In fact, in the last couple of election cycles, the number of women, particularly, and minorities as well, that have been elected to Congress has grown pretty significantly. So they're not as small a number as they used to be. But one of the reasons why they generally are older and they're generally wealthier is because you have to have some influence. You have to have some experience probably to get elected. But more importantly, you have to raise money because it costs a lot of money to run for office. And most average people probably can't raise the kind of money needed to get their name out there and to get the attention they need and get elected to office, although that's not always the case. Who are Texas' two senators? Our two senators are John Cornyn and Ted Cruz. Who is our U.S. representative? This is the representative for our particular area of Texas. His name is Pete Sessions. We're in Congressional District 17. Okay. This is a thought question, and it's not something you have to write an answer down for. It's just something to think about. Should representatives like Pete Sessions, John Cornyn, and Ted Cruz, should they vote the way their constituents, us, want them to, as if they're a delegate just representing our interest, or should they vote for what they think is best, which would make them a trustee? And that's a debate that many people have over the years. Some people believe they should be delegates and should basically do whatever their constituents want them to do. Other people think, well, no, it's hard to know exactly what all your constituents want to do. Most constituents are not fully informed on issues, so it's really hard for them to understand what's going on. And so a representative or senator would really not be able to know that answer. of what their constituents truly want in a situation. So they're really more like trustees and just vote on what they think is best. Which do you think? Take some time to think about that. All right, we're going to move on to number 2 now. Why is the structure of Congress important? Structure influences how representatives are chosen, how people are represented, and how legislation is passed. Now, remember, the structure of our Congress was made by our founding fathers in the Constitution. And so our Congress, the legislative branch of our government, is made up of 2 houses. It's a bicameral legislature. That's a phrase we should have learned in the past. But it is made up of 2 houses. We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. So what we have to look at is how those are broken down, how they work. So in the House of Representatives, every state gets, and we'll talk more about this later, every state gets a number of representatives based on their population. In the Senate, every state gets 2. The Senate is meant to represent states. The House is meant to represent the people. How often are House seats up for election, and how often are Senate seats up for election? House seats are up for re-election every 2 years. So all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years. In the Senate, it's every 6 years. So they are only up for election every 6 years. Their elections are staggered so that every 2 years, 1/3 of senators is up for re-election. And so that's how that works. How many House seats does each state get, and how many Senate seats does each state get? The House seats are apportioned based on population, but every state gets at least 1. So some states like Wyoming, for instance, that has such a small population, they get at least 1. They can't have less than that, but everybody gets 1 or more. Texas currently has 36, although they just recently did the census in 2020. And after the census, when they look at the population, they will do what's called reapportionment, where they rebalance out the representatives among the states. In Texas, because our population has grown over the last 10 years pretty significantly, will probably gain some representatives. California, they've gained some population, but they've also lost some, so they may stay the same or lose 1 or 2 or gain 1 or 2. States like New York and Illinois have lost quite a lot of people from their states over the last 10 years, so they will probably lose some. Florida has gained quite a few. They'll probably gain some seats as well. But every state gets 2 senators. Remember, they're meant to elect to represent the states. And if you recall from what we talked about when the Constitution was written, we founded the Senate because the small states were afraid that if the legislature was only based on population, that they would not have much of a say in anything that gets done. So that's why we have the Senate, to make sure that the small states at least get their voices heard in our government. How did the 17th Amendment make the Senate a more democratic institution? Well, the 17th Amendment, which was passed in the 1910s, allowed voters rather than state legislatures to choose their senators. See, in the Constitution, the senators were originally chosen by the state legislatures, not by the people. So the people elected the state legislators, who then met and elected the state they met and elected the U.S. senators to represent their state in the Senate. That's why they were representatives of the state. But about 100 years ago, the progressive movement was in full swing, and they were trying to make our government a little more democratic. And so they passed the 17th Amendment, which then changed it from election of senators by the state legislature to direct election by the people. So now we vote for our senators ourselves. 100 years ago, about 110 years ago, our legislatures would have voted for them rather than us. Okay. The third question we want to look at is, what is the role of Congress in the system of checks and balances? Congress checks the powers of the executive and the judicial branches. Remember, we have 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. Each one of those branches is technically equal, and they share power, but they have checks and balances on each other to make sure that one branch doesn't become more powerful than it ought to become. And so Congress has checks on the executive and judicial branches. So, for instance, when the Congress passes a law, the president can sign it into law or can veto it. If the president vetoes it, that's his check on the Congress. But if the president vetoes it, 2/3 of Congress can vote to override that veto and make it a law anyway. the president has to appoint certain officials like ambassadors and judges and things like that. Well, the Senate, which is part of the legislative branch, will then have to confirm those appointments. And if they don't, then the president has to pick somebody else. So they have checks and balances on each other. The House can impeach the president and judges, and the Senate would then have to have a trial. And if they vote by a 2/3 majority, convict and remove them. So they have that check and balance. So they check the power of each other. One of the checks and balances that Congress has on the other branches is that they control the power of the purse. So what is the power of the purse? The power of the purse is basically what that means. A purse is what you put your money in. So Congress alone has the power to approve spending by the federal government. In fact, all revenue-raising bills, in other words, any bill that causes Congress, the government, to make money, so in other words, a tax bill, has to start by Constitution in the House of Representatives because they're the closest to the people. And remember, we fought our whole revolution over taxation without representation. So Congress has the power of the purse. They determine what money is going to be appropriated to carry out the various functions of government. In fact, the word appropriation is one of your vocabulary words, and it is a bill that sets aside funds for a specific purpose. Okay, so they have the power of the purse, and they can control the other branches that way. What is the power of advice and consent? The Senate, which is part of Congress, part of the legislative branch, must ratify, that means approve, treaties made by the president. That ratification is done by a 2/3 majority vote in the Senate. There are 100 senators, so it would have to be 67 senators to vote to ratify the treaty. If they vote to ratify the treaty, it becomes law. Okay. They also must vote to confirm presidential appointments to certain offices, like the members of the cabinet, like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, as well as the Supreme Court and other court judges and justices. They also appoint ambassadors and things like that. The president does. The Senate then must confirm those appointments. They do that by a majority vote. What is impeachment power? It's the power that the House to bring formal charges against a federal official. Now, please listen carefully. Most people believe that impeachment is when they are removed from office. That is not what that means. To impeach someone is to bring them up on formal charges. It does not remove that person from office or restrict their powers in any way. Okay. Once the House of Representatives impeaches an official, whether it's the president, the vice president, a judge, a justice, whoever, some federal official, once they impeached him, then the Senate must have a trial. Once that trial is over, the Senate will vote on whether or not to convict and remove that official. For the conviction and removal to take place, the Senate has to vote with a 2/3 vote. In other words, there would have to be 67 votes. So far, 3 presidents have been impeached. President Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, he was not removed by the Senate. They failed to convict him by 1 vote. In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives. Once again, there was a failure to meet the 2/3 threshold for conviction and removal, so he was not removed. President Trump was impeached by the House twice, and in both instances, there was no 2/3 vote to remove him from office, so he stayed in office as well. Okay. All right, that's all we have for this section. Make sure you submit these notes for a grade and do any work that is associated with it. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.